The morning light in Gainesville broke soft and amber through the pines that September, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway where Lawrence Brennan stood beside his truck. The air carried that particular weight of summer's end, humid but cooler now, smelling of red clay and distant wood smoke. A cardinal called from somewhere in the oak tree that overhung the garage, its song sharp and insistent. Lawrence was 41 that year, a man with calloused hands and a quiet demeanor, someone neighbors described as dependable. The kind of person you'd call if you needed help moving furniture or if your car battery died in a parking lot. He wore work boots laced tight, jeans faded at the knees, a gray t-shirt that had seen 100 wash cycles. His daughter Rebecca sat on the tailgate, 9 years old, her legs swinging as she twisted a friendship bracelet around her wrist. Blue and white threads braided tight, the pattern alternating in careful regularity. She had made it herself at summer camp 3 weeks earlier, knotting the pattern over and over until her fingers ached, and the camp counselor had praised her patience, and she wore it everywhere now, even to bed, even in the bath. The cotton fibers were already fraying at the edges, small threads coming loose, but she refused to take it off. Lawrence checked his watch, the old Timex his father had given him decades ago, its face scratched but still keeping perfect time. They had errands to run before noon, the kind of ordinary Saturday routine that stitches weeks together without fanfare. Hardware store first, then the feed supply if they had time. Rebecca asked if they could stop for ice cream afterward, her voice carrying that particular brightness children reserve for small anticipated joys, that rising inflection that turns statements into hopeful questions. He nodded, loading a toolbox into the truck bed, the metal clanging against the ridged liner. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of morning mist that clung to the low places in the yard. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went silent. A neighbor's sprinkler system kicked on with a mechanical hiss. The world felt unremarkable in the way that precedes rupture, though no one knew it yet. Nothing in the air suggested that this morning would be the fulcrum on which everything turned. Before we go further into what happened next, if you're drawn to stories where answers finally emerge from years of silence, where patience and procedure intersect with hope, consider subscribing. These cases matter, and the communities who carry them deserve witness. The work of remembering, of refusing to let someone's absence become invisible, is collective and necessary. And drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Knowing this story reaches across distances makes the telling worthwhile. It reminds us that these aren't just files in a cabinet, but lives that continue to matter decades after the world has moved on. Lawrence turned the ignition. The engine coughed once, then caught, settling into its familiar rumble. Rebecca climbed into the passenger seat, buckled herself in without being asked, pulling the seatbelt across her chest and clicking it into place with the automatic competence of a child who has been taught safety protocols and internalized them. She had her father's dark hair, thick and straight, cut short for summer. She had her mother's careful eyes, brown and observant, the kind of eyes that noticed things, when someone was sad, when a picture hung crooked on a wall, when a stray cat needed feeding. Her mother, Grace, had stayed home that morning with a migraine, the kind that came with nausea and light sensitivity, making even the soft morning sun feel like an assault. She lay in the bedroom with curtains drawn against the brightness, a damp cloth over her eyes, trusting Lawrence to handle the day's logistics. They would pick up fence posts from the hardware supply depot on the north side of town, then stop at the feed store for chicken scratch and maybe some mealworms for the backyard flock. Simple, mapped, predictable. The kind of day that evaporates from memory because nothing distinguishes it from 1,000 others just like it. Except they never came home. The truck pulled out of the driveway at 9:47 in the morning. A neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, saw them pass and waved from her front porch where she was watering geraniums in terracotta pots. Rebecca waved back, the bracelet visible on her small wrist through the open window, catching light as her hand moved. That image would become fixed in Mrs. Alvarez's mind, sharpened by repetition in the weeks that followed. The blue and white threads catching light, the child's hand lifted in greeting, fingers spread wide, the moment still innocent of what it would mean. She would describe it to police officers, to journalists, to other neighbors, each retelling etching the memory deeper until it became the last confirmed sighting, the moment before Lawrence and Rebecca Brennan disappeared into absence. By 3 that afternoon, Grace's headache had faded to a dull background ache. She moved through the house, noting the silence, expecting the rumble of tires on gravel any moment. 4 o'clock came, then 5. She called Lawrence's cell phone and heard it ringing in the kitchen, forgotten on the counter beside his coffee mug, still half full from morning. That first stir of unease, the small cold finger of worry pressing against her chest. She told herself they had run into someone Lawrence knew, gotten delayed talking. Or maybe the truck had broken down and he was dealing with a tow. She made dinner anyway, setting 3 plates, the gesture a kind of bargaining with fate, as if setting his place would guarantee his return. By 6:30, the sky dimming to violet and orange, she called the hardware depot. A young man answered, checked their records, confirmed that Lawrence had picked up the fence posts around 10:15 that morning, paid cash, loaded them himself with help from one of their yard workers. No one remembered anything unusual. He had seemed normal, unhurried. The feed store had no record of him coming in. Grace stood in her kitchen, the phone cord wrapped around her fingers, and felt the air compress around her lungs. She called the police. The Gainesville Police Department treated it seriously from the start. A father and young daughter, together, in a small truck with Georgia plates, last confirmed sighting 5 hours prior. Officer Raymond Holt took the initial report, his notepad filling with details Grace provided, in a voice that kept fracturing and steadying. Fracturing and steadying. Lawrence's height, weight, what he was wearing that morning. Rebecca's description, the pink t-shirt with a cartoon character she loved, denim shorts with pockets, white sneakers with purple laces she had chosen herself, the bracelet. Grace described it carefully. The blue and white pattern, handmade at camp, never removed even when Grace suggested it needed washing. Holt wrote it down in careful block letters, underlined it. He radioed patrol units, initiated a bolo, be on the lookout. Before midnight, volunteers had gathered at the fire station, organizing into search teams. The mobilization was swift and thorough, the kind of response small communities summon when one of their own goes missing. Search teams fanned out along the routes Lawrence would have taken, flashlights sweeping ditches and tree lines, calling Rebecca's name into the darkness. Bloodhounds worked the scent trail from the driveway, their handlers watching as the dogs circled, noses to the ground, then headed toward the main road where they lost it. Too many vehicles having passed, too many competing scents. Flyers appeared on telephone poles by dawn, printed at someone's home office and distributed by people who had never met the Brennans, but understood that this could be anyone's child, anyone's family. Rebecca's school photo smiling out, gap-toothed and sweet. Lawrence's driver's license photo beside it, his expression serious the way people look when forced to sit still for bureaucratic photographs. The local news ran the story on the evening broadcast. Tips began trickling in before the segment ended. A gas station attendant in Dawsonville, 30 miles northeast, thought he remembered a man and girl matching the description around 11 that morning. A woman in Dahlonega reported seeing a blue pickup with a child inside at a roadside rest stop. Said the girl looked scared. Each lead sent teams scrambling, hope spiking, only to dissolve under scrutiny. Wrong truck model, different state plates, misremembered timelines. The gas station attendant reviewed his security footage 3 times and admitted he had conflated 2 separate customers, his memory creating a composite that matched what he wanted to help with. The woman in Dahlonega grew uncertain under gentle questioning, her confidence eroding until she apologized, saying maybe she had imagined it. Maybe she had wanted so badly to help that she had invented the memory. 2 weeks in, a hiker found a section of blue fabric snagged on barbed wire near Lake Lanier, caught on the twisted metal of an old fence line that separated forest from private property. The discovery sent a current of dread through the investigation. Forensics examined it carefully under laboratory conditions. The fabric was cotton, faded, but the weave did not match Rebecca's shirt. Chemical analysis suggested it had been there longer, weathered through multiple seasons, possibly years. Still, divers combed the lake's murky shallows for 3 days, dragging weighted lines across the bottom, searching for anything that might be a vehicle or remains. They found old tires, shopping carts, a rusted motorcycle, but nothing connected to the Brennans. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation joined the case in week 3. Agents interviewed everyone who had known Lawrence, mapping his routines with obsessive thoroughness, searching for anything that might suggest intent to disappear. They found nothing that fit that pattern. No financial trouble beyond the ordinary pressures of raising a family on a contractor's income. No legal issues, no hidden debts, no secret second life. His bank accounts showed regular deposits and withdrawals, nothing unusual. No large cash withdrawals in the days before. No suspicious purchases. Friends and family described him as devoted, even-tempered. Someone who showed up when he said he would and followed through on commitments. Rebecca's teachers painted her as bright and well-adjusted, a child who laughed easily and made friends without difficulty. There was no custody dispute, no estrangement. Grace and Lawrence had been married 14 years, weathering the ordinary difficulties of any marriage, but fundamentally steady, fundamentally committed. Jurisdictional questions complicated things as days turned to weeks. The route between Gainesville and the depot crossed county lines, touching Hall and Forsyth counties, creating questions about which agency held primary responsibility. Coordination meetings became necessary. Resources stretched thin across multiple departments. The FBI offered assistance under protocols for missing children, but without evidence of abduction or interstate flight. Their involvement remained peripheral, advisory rather than operational. Leads dried up as October arrived. The search perimeter expanded, then contracted as resources had to be allocated elsewhere. As newer emergencies demanded attention, Grace stopped sleeping in the bedroom she had shared with Lawrence. The space felt too large, the silence too complete. She moved to the couch, television on low through the night, old movies playing to fill the emptiness, waiting for headlights that never came. Her sister Patricia moved in to help, to make sure Grace ate something each day, to answer the phone when reporters called asking for updates or interviews. The community held vigils. Candles flickered in the September wind, then October, then November. People gathering at the park where Rebecca used to play, singing hymns and offering prayers into the darkness. Rebecca's 10th birthday passed in December. Grace baked a cake anyway, chocolate with vanilla frosting the way Rebecca liked it, set it on the table with 10 candles, and wept until no more tears would come. The financial toll mounted quietly, the way slow disasters do. Grace could not work regularly. Her focus shattered, her mind constantly circling back to possibilities and nightmares. She would sit at her desk and realize an hour had passed, without her remembering what she was supposed to be doing. Savings drained toward private investigators who promised fresh perspectives and delivered reports that said essentially what police had already determined. The mortgage payments became irregular. Late notices arrived in the mail. Friends organized fundraisers, spaghetti dinners at the community center, silent auctions with donated items. The generosity was real and necessary, and never quite enough to bridge the gap between what Grace needed and what resources allowed. She kept Rebecca's room exactly as it had been. The bed made with the quilted comforter Rebecca had chosen herself. Stuffed animals arranged against the pillows in the specific order she preferred. Homework left unfinished on the small desk. A math worksheet with problems half completed in careful pencil. Holidays became cruelties. Thanksgiving arrived with an empty chair at the table that no one could bring themselves to remove. Christmas lights blinked in windows across the neighborhood while Grace left hers dark, unable to muster the energy for celebration when her family was incomplete. She kept Lawrence's voicemail greeting unchanged on the home phone, just to hear his voice saying, "You've reached the Brennans, please leave a message." The sound of his recorded words became a ritual and a torment, something she would call just to hear, then hang up before the beep. Each new year felt like betrayal. Time moving forward while Lawrence and Rebecca remained suspended somewhere beyond reach. Unchanging. Unknown. Detective Holt, promoted to investigator within the department, kept the case active even as newer emergencies demanded attention. He reviewed the file every few months, looking for angles they might have missed, connections they hadn't seen. He ran periodic checks on unidentified remains found across the southeastern states, comparing descriptions against Lawrence and Rebecca's profiles. Nothing matched. The truck had never been recovered, never pinged a toll reader or traffic camera. It was as if they had driven into absence itself, crossing some invisible threshold between the known world and oblivion. By the third year, the case was functionally cold, not closed officially. Missing persons cases rarely close unless there's definitive proof of death or recovery. But dormant, waiting for something to shift. Investigators understood the statistics grimly well. After 72 hours, the probability of recovery drops precipitously. After months, the question shifts from rescue to remains. After years, hope becomes a kind of endurance, stripped of expectation, a decision to keep believing not because evidence supports it, but because the alternative is unbearable. Grace learned the language of ambiguous loss, that particular grief where absence has no closure. Therapists explained the psychological toll of living in perpetual uncertainty, how the human mind struggles with unresolved endings, how we are wired to seek completion and suffer when it's withheld. Support groups connected her with other families navigating the same strange territory, where loved ones existed neither fully gone nor retrievable, trapped in a liminal space that society has few resources for addressing. She attended when she could bear it, finding solace in shared recognition, the way others understood without her needing to explain why she still set 3 plates sometimes, or why she couldn't throw away Lawrence's clothes. The community eventually recalibrated around her presence. People stopped asking if there was news, the question having become too painful to voice repeatedly. The answer always the same disappointed silence. They brought casseroles less frequently, resumed normal conversations in the grocery store, included her in book clubs and neighborhood gatherings, while tacitly acknowledging the wound that never healed. Grace returned to work part-time 3 years after the disappearance, administrative tasks at a medical clinic that required only a fraction of her attention, but gave her somewhere to be, something to do that wasn't waiting. She moved through days. Years stacked like sediment, layer upon layer of ordinary moments, without the people who should have filled them. What she did not know, could not have known, was how the case remained threaded through databases and protocols, waiting for intersection. In 2019, 22 years after the disappearance, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation received federal funding to digitize old case files, part of a larger initiative to reduce bureaucratic lag in cold cases and improve cross-jurisdictional information sharing. Lawrence and Rebecca's information was entered into updated systems, cross-referenced with missing persons databases maintained by the National Crime Information Center, DNA repositories managed by CODIS, and unidentified remains records tracked by the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. The process was administrative, invisible, the kind of background work that happens without fanfare, clerks and technicians entering data that might sit dormant for years or might suddenly connect with something unexpected. Simultaneously, advances in genealogical DNA analysis were reshaping investigative possibilities in profound ways. Techniques that had once required perfect samples now worked with degraded material. Databases expanded exponentially as commercial genealogy services grew popular. Millions of people voluntarily uploading their genetic information, creating vast networks of familial connections that could be queried for matches. Investigators began submitting old evidence for retesting using newer methods. Cases stacked in evidence rooms for decades suddenly viable again. The technological turn created new opportunities, though the work remained painstaking, methodical, dependent on funding and staffing and time, and the willingness of agencies to revisit cases they had considered exhausted. In 2021, 24 years after the disappearance, a clerical audit in the Tennessee Department of Health and Human Services flagged an irregularity during routine quality control review. A woman named Margaret Lane, living in a small town outside Knoxville, had applied for disability benefits due to chronic health issues and limited work capacity. Her intake file noted she had no prior employment records in Tennessee or bordering states going back more than a decade. No tax history. No documented education beyond statements that she had completed elementary school somewhere she couldn't quite remember. When pressed for supporting documentation, birth certificate, social security card, school transcripts, she had become anxious, deflecting questions, offering explanations that didn't quite cohere. The social worker, trained to recognize trafficking patterns and identity concealment through specialized training programs, made a note in the file and submitted it through proper channels for further review. The note sat in a queue for 6 months before an analyst, following protocols for potential identity fraud or trafficking victim identification, ran Margaret's details through broader databases. The absence of records before 2009 raised a significant flag. The analyst widened the search parameters, looking for matches not in what existed, but in what should have existed and did not. Margaret Lane's stated age was 37. If accurate, she should have generated some paper trail in the previous 3 decades. School records, medical visits, employment, something. There was nothing before a Tennessee driver's license issued in 2009, when she would have been 25. Before that, Margaret Lane did not exist in any official capacity. The analyst ran her physical description through missing persons databases, adjusting for age progression using software that could estimate how a child's face might mature over decades. Height, build, distinctive markers. Rebecca Brennan's file surfaced among dozens of possibilities. The age fit. Rebecca would be 35 in 2021. The region, Tennessee bordering Georgia, created plausible proximity. But it was not enough for action. Dozens of missing children matched similar parameters. The analyst noted the potential connection and moved it to a secondary queue for follow-up when resources allowed, flagging it for review if any additional information surfaced. 3 more months passed. Then, in early 2022, a Knoxville police officer responding to a noise complaint at an apartment complex encountered Margaret Lane during routine follow-up. She was calm, cooperative, apologizing for her neighbor's television volume even though she wasn't responsible, explaining that the neighbor was elderly and hard of hearing. The officer filed a routine report, the kind generated by thousands of minor calls daily. In the report, he noted a small detail. Margaret wore a distinctive bracelet, blue and white woven threads, visibly aged and fraying but still intact. He had commented on it, asking if it was handmade, and she had touched it reflexively, protective, saying only that she had worn it a long time, longer than she could really remember, that it felt important somehow, though she didn't know why. The report entered the system. A database query, automated and algorithmic, programmed to scan for keywords associated with flagged cases, pinged. Blue and white bracelet, intersected with Rebecca Brennan's description. The system generated a notification, sending it to a review queue where it sat for 2 days before a human investigator reviewed it, cross-referenced the earlier identity query on Margaret Lane, and felt the kind of cautious awareness that comes from seeing patterns align without confirmation. The investigative instinct that something might be there. Detective Holt, now nearing retirement after 4 decades in law enforcement, received the call on a Tuesday afternoon in March. The voice on the line was professional, measured, a young investigator from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, outlining the coincidences without overpromising. A woman in Tennessee with no documented history before 2009. A bracelet matching a distinctive detail from a Georgia cold case. Age appropriate for Rebecca Brennan, now 36 if alive. Holt felt his pulse quicken, the old familiar spike of adrenaline tempered by decades of false hopes and dead ends. He pulled the file immediately, the physical folder worn from years of handling, reviewing details he had memorized so thoroughly he could recite them in his sleep. The next step required extraordinary delicacy. Investigators could not simply approach Margaret Lane and demand answers. Could not march in and announce that they believed she was someone else. If she was Rebecca, trauma might have fractured memory, identity, sense of self in ways that made confrontation dangerous or re-traumatizing. If she was not Rebecca, if this was another coincidence in a case built on disappointments, the intrusion would be unforgivable and potentially actionable. They needed verification that respected autonomy while pursuing truth, a balance that required legal precision and ethical care. A forensic genealogist, Dr. Patricia Owens, was brought into consultation. She specialized in cases where identity had been obscured or lost, working with law enforcement to navigate the ethical and technical challenges of DNA analysis when traditional methods had failed. She had helped solve cold cases through familial DNA searches, identified disaster victims when direct matches weren't available, reunited adoptees with biological families. She reviewed Margaret Lane's limited records and suggested an indirect approach. If Margaret had any interaction with the healthcare system that involved biological sample collection, a sample might exist in storage, obtained previously for unrelated medical reasons. It was a long shot, but sometimes long shots land when nothing else will. The team discovered that Margaret had been treated at a Knoxville urgent care clinic in 2020 for a minor infection, routine care that had required blood work. The clinic, following standard protocols and state regulations, had retained biological samples for a specified period before disposal for quality control and potential follow-up testing. The samples were still in storage, frozen and labeled. A warrant was obtained under specific privacy protections, allowing forensic testing without Margaret's knowledge while she was not a suspect in any crime. The legal ground was delicate, approved only because of the severity of the missing child case, the length of time elapsed, and the non-invasive nature of testing already collected material. Multiple attorneys reviewed the request before a judge signed off, everyone aware that privacy rights had to be balanced against the possibility of solving a case that had haunted families and investigators for over 2 decades. Dr. Owens submitted the sample to a laboratory specializing in kinship analysis, facilities that handled sensitive cases requiring absolute accuracy. Grace Brennan, still living in the same house in Gainesville, maintaining Rebecca's room as a kind of shrine and Lawrence's memory as a daily companion, was contacted by Detective Holt personally. He drove to her home, sat at her kitchen table, and explained carefully that there was a potential lead, no guarantees, nothing certain. He asked if she would provide a DNA sample. Grace agreed immediately, her hands shaking as she signed consent forms. She had given samples before, years earlier, when databases were first being established after cases like Rebecca's pushed for better systems. She gave another now, the swab quick and simple and almost absurdly mundane against the magnitude of what it might reveal. 3 weeks later, the results arrived in a sealed envelope that Dr. Owens opened in the presence of Detective Holt and 2 other investigators serving as witnesses. Mitochondrial DNA, passed maternally through generations and used when other methods aren't viable, showed a match between Grace Brennan and Margaret Lane at markers consistent with a mother-daughter relationship. The probability of coincidence was statistically negligible, something like 1 in several million. Additional nuclear DNA markers, where quality allowed testing, supported the conclusion. Margaret Lane was Rebecca Brennan. Alive. 36 years old. Living under another name in Tennessee. 70 miles from where she had disappeared 27 years earlier. Close enough that they had existed in adjacent regions for decades without knowing. The room where investigators received the results went silent. The kind of profound silence that comes when reality shifts in ways that seem impossible. Detective Holt sat down heavily, the enormity settling over him like physical weight. Rebecca Brennan had been found. After 27 years, 13 weeks, and 4 days, she was no longer missing. But the questions that rose in the wake of confirmation were vast and tangled. Where had she been for those years? Who was Margaret Lane? What had happened during the time between disappearance and her emergence in Tennessee? And the question that haunted everyone: what had happened to Lawrence? The approach was planned with extraordinary care over the following 2 weeks. Trauma specialists, victim advocates, law enforcement, and legal advisors coordinated. The priority was Rebecca's well-being above all else, her autonomy, her right to process revelation on her own terms without coercion or harm. No one knew what she remembered, what she had been told about her own history, what capacity she had to absorb truth that might shatter the fragile identity she had constructed. The decision was made to reach out through a social worker she already knew and trusted, someone she had worked with during her disability application, in a familiar setting that wouldn't trigger alarm. The goal was contact, not confrontation, information, rather than interrogation. Margaret Lane was asked to come to the social services office for a routine follow-up on her disability application, a request that seemed ordinary and bureaucratic. She arrived on time, dressed neatly in jeans and a cardigan despite the warmth, carrying a worn shoulder bag. She sat across from the social worker in a small office with soft lighting and comfortable chairs, hands folded in her lap, the blue and white bracelet visible on her left wrist. The social worker began gently, explaining that some questions had arisen about Margaret's background during the normal verification process, not for punitive reasons, but to ensure she received all services she was entitled to, that sometimes people who had experienced trauma or displacement qualified for additional support. Margaret nodded, uncertain but cooperative, accustomed to questions she couldn't fully answer. Then the social worker said the name, quietly and carefully. Rebecca Brennan. Do you know that name? Have you ever heard it before? Margaret's face went utterly still, color draining from her cheeks as if someone had opened a valve. Her breathing shifted, rapid and shallow, her chest rising and falling too quickly. She looked at the door, measuring distance, then back at the social worker, her hands gripping the chair arms hard enough that her knuckles went white. The social worker, trained extensively for this exact moment, spoke softly and steadily, assuring her she was safe, that no one was there to harm her or take her anywhere she didn't want to go, that people who cared about her wanted only to help her understand her own story, that she had choices and control and time. Margaret began to cry, though not sobs but silent tears, the kind that come from places beyond words, from depths that don't have language attached. She touched the bracelet on her wrist with her other hand, rubbing the frayed threads between her fingers, the gesture automatic and protective. She whispered, her voice barely audible, that she did not know, that she had never known, that she had no memories before waking in a hospital in Tennessee, when doctors told her she was 25 years old, confused and alone, and unable to say who she was or where she had come from. That someone, a social worker, a kind woman whose face she couldn't quite remember, had helped her choose a name, had said she needed to be called something, and Margaret Lane had felt as good as anything when nothing felt familiar. That she had believed it because she had nothing else to believe, no other story to hold on to. The revelation unfolded in pieces over days and then weeks, each conversation adding another fragment to a picture that would never be complete. Margaret, Rebecca, was moved to a secure location with her consent, a facility that specialized in trauma recovery where she could process with professionals trained in dissociation and identity disruption. Medical records from 2009 were retrieved and reviewed carefully. She had been found unconscious on a rural roadside in eastern Tennessee by a passing motorist, dehydrated and disoriented and non-responsive to questions, with no identification, no wallet, no phone. Hospital staff had treated her for severe malnutrition, dehydration, exposure to elements, and signs of long-term psychological trauma. When she regained consciousness after 2 days, she could not say who she was, or where she had come from, or how she had ended up on that roadside. Amnesia, the doctors had concluded, possibly trauma-induced, possibly the result of head injury, though scans showed no obvious damage. Social services had assigned her a temporary identity to navigate legal systems that require names and numbers, helped her apply for a social security card and identification, and she had built a fragile life within those constraints, never quite feeling real, never quite feeling like Margaret Lane was actually her. But the amnesia had not been complete in the way total memory loss would be. She had retained skills, language, procedural knowledge, emotional imprints. She knew how to read, how to write in cursive, how to cook certain specific foods though she didn't know where she had learned. She could braid thread into intricate patterns, her fingers remembering what her mind didn't. She carried fear without understanding its source, panic attacks triggered by sounds she couldn't identify, spaces she couldn't name. She avoided certain places, certain situations, basements, storage facilities, anywhere with heavy doors and locks, without knowing why, her body remembering what her consciousness had blocked. And she wore the bracelet, feeling obscurely that losing it would mean losing herself, that it was the only continuous thread connecting her to something real, even if she didn't know what. Investigators worked carefully to piece together the timeline, knowing that each question asked of Rebecca might cause harm. That memory could not be forced without ethical and psychological cost. In 2009, Rebecca would have been 25, the age Margaret believed herself to be when found. 16 years had passed since the 1997 disappearance. Where had she been in those years? What had happened to her and to Lawrence? The answers required Rebecca to recover memory that might not exist in retrievable form, that might be too painful to access, that might have been fractured into pieces too small to reassemble. Therapists worked with her using trauma-informed techniques developed for survivors of extreme abuse, not pushing or demanding, but creating space for whatever might surface safely, letting her control the pace and depth of exploration. Over weeks and then months, fragments emerged. Not coherent narratives, but sensations, images, feelings. The smell of diesel fuel, the sound of a heavy door locking with a metal clang that echoed. Cold concrete under her hands and knees. Darkness that went on for hours or days, she couldn't tell which. A man's voice, though she couldn't remember words or tone. Just the fact of it speaking commands. Long stretches of isolation where time became meaningless. Fear so pervasive it became ambient, not spikes of terror, but a constant low-frequency dread that eventually felt normal. Rebecca could not construct a coherent story from these pieces, but the fragments suggested captivity, prolonged isolation, something that had fractured her sense of self so completely that even her own name had dissolved into nothing. Investigators ran the details through databases of unsolved crimes, trafficking cases, abduction patterns across Tennessee and surrounding states. They found a case from 2008 that made everyone go silent when they read it. A man named Vernon Hackett had been arrested in eastern Tennessee for holding a woman against her will in a storage facility he owned, keeping her in a modified unit with reinforced walls and a lock that couldn't be opened from inside. The woman, in her 30s, had managed to escape when Hackett made a procedural error during one of his infrequent visits, and she had fled to a main road where she flagged down help. Her testimony had led to his arrest. During the subsequent investigation, authorities had found evidence suggesting he had held others previously over a span of years, though no other victims had been identified at the time. Modifications to multiple units. Supplies purchased in quantities that suggested more than one captive. Financial records showing patterns consistent with maintaining people long-term. Hackett had refused to cooperate, providing no information about anyone else. He had died in prison in 2011 of a heart attack, taking whatever he knew to his grave, leaving questions that investigators had eventually been forced to abandon. Detective Holt traveled to Tennessee personally and reviewed the original case file with investigators who had worked it. Among items recovered from Hackett's property and cataloged in evidence were personal effects that had never been matched to known victims. Boxes of belongings that seemed to represent multiple people across multiple time periods. One item, stored in a plastic evidence bag and labeled with a case number, was a child's backpack, faded blue with cartoon characters that had been popular in the mid-1990s, water-damaged and partially deteriorated. Inside the backpack, wrapped in plastic to preserve it, was a small spiral notebook with a cardboard cover, the kind elementary school students use for classwork. The notebook had a name written inside the front cover in careful child's handwriting. The letters formed with the deliberate precision of someone still learning. Rebecca. Below it, a date written in the same hand. September 1997. The backpack and notebook were submitted for DNA testing using the most sensitive methods available, techniques that could extract profiles from minimal cellular material. Epithelial cells recovered from the backpack's shoulder straps, left there by years of contact with skin, matched Rebecca's DNA profile. The notebook's pages, though degraded by time and moisture, showed drawings of houses and trees and stick figure families. Simple math problems consistent with third-grade level work. Spelling words written in rows for practice. It had been hers. She had been there, in Hackett's custody, held in those storage units for an unknowable length of time, while the world searched and then stopped searching. But what of Lawrence? The question haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Had he been killed during the initial abduction? Had he died trying to protect Rebecca? Had he been held somewhere else? Or had something entirely different happened to him? Searchers returned to the area where Hackett had operated in 1997, a semi-rural region that had been more isolated then, using ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs trained to detect remains even decades old. In a wooded area behind the storage facility, now abandoned and overgrown with kudzu and volunteer trees, they found something. Skeletal remains buried in a shallow grave covered with layers of leaf litter and soil, partially scattered by animals but largely intact. Forensic analysis confirmed the bones were human, male, consistent with Lawrence Brennan's age and build at the time of disappearance. Dental records provided definitive identification through comparison with Lawrence's dental X-rays from 1995, a routine checkup that became the key to confirming his identity decades after death. Lawrence had died there, likely within days of the abduction based on what limited evidence remained. The manner of death, given the decomposition and time elapsed, could not be precisely determined, but evidence of trauma to the skull suggested blunt force, homicide almost certainly. He had not abandoned his daughter or chosen to disappear. He had not started a new life somewhere else or walked away from his family. He had died there in those woods trying to protect Rebecca, trying to prevent what could not be prevented. The confirmation was agony and relief intertwined for everyone who had known him. An answer, terrible but real. An end to uncertainty that had lasted 27 years. Grace Brennan received the news in stages, delivered by Detective Holt and a victim advocate in her living room, the same room where she had waited for Lawrence to come home that first night. First, that Rebecca was alive, that they had found her, that she was safe now. The joy was disorienting, unmooring, too large for her body to contain. She wept and could not stop weeping, great heaving sobs that came from a place she had kept locked for decades. Then, when she could breathe again, they told her about Lawrence. That he was dead. Had been dead all these years. That he had died trying to save their daughter. The grief was not new. She had grieved him for 27 years. But its confirmation changed its character. Transformed it from ambiguous loss into something concrete that could finally be mourned in completion rather than suspension. She had been right to keep hoping for Rebecca, and right to fear the worst for Lawrence. Both things were true, and holding them together was almost unbearable. The reunion between Grace and Rebecca happened slowly, carefully, mediated by professionals who understood the complexity of reconnection after decades of separation and trauma. Rebecca had no memory of Grace, no recognition when shown photographs, no emotional imprint of motherhood or childhood. To her, Grace was a stranger claiming a relationship that existed in documents and DNA, but not an experience or feeling. But Grace approached with extraordinary patience, born of decades of waiting, bringing photographs and small objects from Rebecca's childhood, offering connection without demanding reciprocation or recognition. Rebecca looked at pictures of herself as a child, birthday parties, the first day of kindergarten, sitting on Lawrence's shoulders, and saw a person she did not know, a life that felt like fiction. But she looked at the bracelet in the photos, the same one on her wrist in every image, and felt something stirred deep in her chest, some wordless recognition that lived below conscious thought. They began to build a relationship, not picking up where they had left off. That was impossible. The child Rebecca had been was gone, and the adult she had become was shaped by experiences neither of them could fully access. But constructing something new from the ruins of what had been lost. Grace told stories about Rebecca's childhood, small memories that carried no weight of expectation. How Rebecca had loved strawberries but only if they were cut into tiny pieces. How she used to line up her stuffed animals in order of size before bed every night. How she had taught herself to whistle and had driven Lawrence crazy practicing constantly for weeks. Rebecca listened, sometimes crying silently, sometimes numb and disconnected, sometimes genuinely curious about this person she had been. Therapists helped them navigate boundaries, manage expectations, honor the fact that Rebecca was an adult with autonomy who got to choose what relationship, if any, she wanted to build. Legal proceedings unfolded with bureaucratic complexity. Rebecca qualified for victim compensation funds, resources designed to aid survivors of violent crime in rebuilding their lives. Grace advocated fiercely for her, navigating bureaucracies that struggled to accommodate someone whose identity had been fractured and restored, whose life existed in two incompatible versions. The state of Tennessee issued Rebecca a corrected birth certificate, replacing the temporary documents issued to Margaret Lane, restoring her original name and birth date. The correction was symbolic but profoundly significant, a reclaiming of identity that legal systems had nearly erased. Social Security records were updated. Rebecca's work history as Margaret Lane was reconciled with her newly restored identity, a complex process that required lawyers and patience. Rebecca chose to keep living in Tennessee after being offered the option to relocate, needing space to process without the weight of returning to Georgia, to places that carried histories she could not remember and might never recover. The idea of Gainesville, of the house where she had supposedly grown up, felt overwhelming and foreign. Grace visited regularly, every few weeks at first, and then settling into a monthly rhythm, learning to be present without imposing, offering support while scrupulously respecting autonomy. Their relationship grew in small increments, trust earned slowly through consistent showing up, connection fragile, but real. They talked on the phone weekly, brief conversations about ordinary things that gradually became easier, less loaded with the weight of everything unsaid. Advocacy became part of the aftermath, a way to transform suffering into meaning. Grace worked with organizations focused on long-term missing persons, pushing for better database integration, more resources for cold case reviews, mandatory training for social workers and healthcare providers to recognize potential matches in clients without clear histories. She testified before state legislators about the need for funding, her testimony carrying the authority of lived experience. Rebecca, when she felt ready years later, participated in public awareness campaigns, her face and story becoming a testament to the possibility of recovery even decades later, even when hope seems irrational. They were careful, both of them, to protect Rebecca's privacy, while acknowledging that visibility might help other families. The blue and white bracelet, frayed and faded and precious, was photographed extensively and placed in an evidence archive as part of the permanent case record. Rebecca asked for it back once the legal proceedings concluded, once it was no longer needed as evidence. Authorities agreed after consultation with her therapist, understanding its symbolic importance. She wore it still, though now she understood what it meant, a link to a childhood she could not remember but refused to abandon. It was evidence and talisman both, proof that even in the longest silences, even when identity itself dissolves, traces remain. Small things endure. Gainesville held a memorial service for Lawrence in the spring, decades after his disappearance, bringing closure the community had waited a generation to receive. People gathered at the same church where his wedding had been held, where Rebecca had been baptized, where vigils had been held in those first desperate weeks. Grace stood at the front, flanked by Rebecca and her sister Patricia, and spoke about Lawrence's quiet decency, his reliability, his love for his daughter, his sacrifice. She said his name aloud, making him present again in collective memory, giving him the funeral that should have happened 27 years earlier. People who had searched for him in those first desperate weeks returned, older now, hair grayed, carrying their own griefs and reliefs. The detective who had never given up. The neighbor who had waved goodbye. The volunteers who had walked miles calling Rebecca's name. The service was closure of a kind, imperfect but necessary, acknowledging both loss and the miracle of partial recovery. Rebecca continued therapy intensively for years, working through trauma that might never fully resolve, learning to live with fragmentation. Dissociative amnesia, her doctors explained with careful compassion, sometimes lifts and sometimes does not. The brain protects itself in ways that cannot be undone through will alone, creating barriers that serve survival even when they cause suffering. She accepted this difficult truth, learning to live with the strange reality of a life divided into before and after, with the before accessible only through others' memories and photographs and objects she could not connect to feeling. She found work eventually, part-time positions that accommodated her needs. She made friends slowly, people who knew her as Rebecca, who accepted that she had gaps and boundaries, who did not demand explanations for reactions she could not explain herself. She built routines, small rituals of normalcy. She learned that recovery is not restoration but the construction of something new from irrevocable loss. Grace kept the house in Gainesville, but finally, after years of therapy encouraging her to let go, redecorated Rebecca's room, transforming it from a shrine frozen in time into a guest space where Rebecca could stay when she visited, if she wanted to. Letting go of preservation was its own kind of grief, an acknowledgement that the child Rebecca had been was gone, irretrievable, that time cannot be reversed or undone. But the woman she had become deserved space to exist, without being haunted by who she might have been, had everything been different. Grace learned to live with both the miracle of return and the reality of what could not be recovered, holding gratitude and grief in the same breath. Years moved forward. Rebecca's case became part of training materials for law enforcement across multiple states, an example of how persistence and technological advances and interdisciplinary cooperation could solve even the coldest cases. Database integration improved, with agencies sharing information more efficiently. Protocols for handling potential matches evolved, incorporating trauma-informed approaches. Training programs for social workers included modules on recognizing potential missing persons in clients without clear documented histories. Small systemic changes that might prevent another family from waiting 27 years for answers. That might help someone like Rebecca be identified sooner, reconnected faster. The story did not end with simple resolution, because trauma does not dissolve because truth emerges. Relationships fractured by decades of absence and unimaginable violence do not heal overnight or completely. Identity shattered cannot be perfectly reassembled. But something profound shifted nonetheless. A name restored, a life reclaimed from erasure, a mother and daughter learning each other again, building connection across the chasm of missing years, and a community holding space for both grief and gratitude, understanding that they are not opposites but companions in the long work of living through loss and finding meaning in survival. Grace established a small foundation in Lawrence's name, focused on supporting families of long-term missing persons and funding cold case reviews. The foundation partnered with forensic genealogists, providing grants for DNA testing in cases that lacked resources. It advocated for legislative changes requiring better coordination between agencies, mandatory entry of missing persons into national databases, and protection for trafficking victims who might not know their own identities. The work gave purpose to the years of waiting, transforming suffering into something that might spare others the same prolonged agony. Rebecca participated when she felt able, speaking at conferences for victim advocates, her presence a powerful testament. She talked about the importance of treating people without documentation or clear histories with dignity rather than suspicion. How social workers and healthcare providers might be the first to notice signs that someone's identity had been stolen or suppressed. Her testimony was quiet but compelling, carrying the authority of lived experience that no academic study could replicate. The case prompted discussions about how missing children investigations transition as victims age into adulthood. How systems often fail to imagine that a child missing for decades might be alive, might be walking among us with a different name and no memory of who they were. Age progression software improved. Cross-referencing protocols expanded. Small incremental changes in how agencies approached cases that had gone cold. If Rebecca's story resonates, if it reminds you why these cases matter even decades after the world has moved on, consider supporting organizations that work with families of the missing and survivors of long-term captivity. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children maintains databases and provides resources for families navigating the unbearable weight. The DOE network works to match unidentified persons with missing persons reports. Volunteer investigators giving hours to cases law enforcement can no longer prioritize. Local victim advocacy groups provide counseling and practical support to those rebuilding lives after trauma. The Polaris Project works with trafficking survivors, understanding that some do not know they are missing, that identity itself can be a casualty of captivity. These organizations sustain the work of witness and recovery when official resources run thin, when cases grow cold, when families are told there is nothing more to be done. Every cold case represents a family waiting, a person whose absence creates a wound that will not close until there are answers. Every effort toward resolution, no matter how long delayed, affirms that those who vanish are not forgotten, that their lives matter, that their names matter. And sometimes, against all probability and reasonable expectation, against the statistics that say hope is irrational after so many years, they come home. Changed, yes. Fractured, undoubtedly, but alive. Still here. Still deserving of every effort we can make to bring them back from the dark. Rebecca Brennan came home after 27 years. Not whole, but alive. Not unchanged, but found. Her father did not survive, but his sacrifice protected her long enough that she could be recovered, could be given a chance to rebuild. Their story is extraordinary, but the need it represents is not. Right now, tens of thousands of people are missing across this country alone. Some will be found quickly, some never. But some, like Rebecca, are waiting in plain sight for someone to notice, to connect the pieces, to speak a name they have forgotten but their bones remember. The work of looking, of remembering, of refusing to accept disappearance as final matters. It always matters.